may proceed.
May it please the court. Please introduce yourself to the jury.
My name is Glenn Farrig, F as in Frank, A-H-R-I-G.
How do you pronounce your last name?
Farrig.
All right. Welcome to Jacksonville. Could you please let the jury know what you do for a living?
Good afternoon. I work as a forensic biologist at the Forensic Science Lab in Washington for the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, otherwise known as the ATF.
How long have you been so employed?
I've been with that laboratory since November of 2017, so almost but not quite 9 years.
And during the course of your experience in working for the ATF Forensic Biology Unit, have you been allowed to come into courts like this one and provide your expert opinion in the field of STR DNA technology and the statistical component to that?
Yes, I have previously testified to the work that I've done.
And Your Honor, this time I would tender, without going through his entire training and background, for potential voir dire after this qualification.
Any questions?
No, Your Honor.
Okay, thank you. You may proceed.
So since you've been testifying as an expert in DNA, could you explain to the jury what deoxyribonucleic acid is and why it's important forensic?
So DNA, or deoxyribonucleic acid, is something that's found within the cells of living organisms. You can think of it like a set of blueprints or instructions that tell a living thing how to develop and grow. It can be useful in a forensic context because there is some variation between individuals with regard to their DNA so that we can use it to distinguish between individuals. It is fairly consistent throughout the body, so if your body produces it, it doesn't matter what type of sample it is. If the DNA comes from sweat or from skin or from bones or from teeth, the DNA profile is expected to be consistent throughout an individual. The DNA is also persistent over time, so that if we test DNA from an item from a crime scene and then months or years down the road we test DNA from an individual and do a comparison, we expect that DNA to retain its properties over time.
In other words, your DNA doesn't morph as you age.
Right. Your DNA is not expected to change with respect to the markers that we test and the profiles that we obtain as you age.
So the forensic differences that you look at to distinguish between individuals, are those locations on the DNA molecule, do they code for things like hair color or eye color?
We do a type of testing that's referred to as STR testing. STR stands for short tandem repeats. These are sections of DNA that do not code for physical characteristics.
So you briefly mentioned that DNA can be found in all of your cells. How is it left behind in the forensic scene? You mentioned some of those, but just explain how it's left.
There can be a couple of factors that determine how exactly a DNA profile is left. There's a phenomenon which we would refer to as touch DNA, the idea that someone can touch or handle an object, and without saying with absolute certainty where the source of that DNA is from, it's possible that there are material from the skin cells that could be deposited. There could be secretions from the skin layers that could be deposited. There could be, if somebody has habits of touching their face or touching the area around their mouth, DNA could be moved around. But the idea is, however the DNA arrives and is deposited on an item, there is this concept of touch DNA where something could simply be handled or touched and leave but not behind enough material that somebody could come behind and test that item and get a DNA profile.
So in addition to touch DNA, is leaving your blood behind, leaving your spit behind, leaving your semen behind, do things like that, is that how DNA can be left behind in this?
Yes, we can also test bulk fluids, relatively large deposits or stains that could also have DNA that can be detected and characterized and compared.
Is it fair to say that what you refer to as bulk fluid, that contains more DNA molecules than touch DNA can?
In general, I would say so, that the amounts of DNA that might be expected with something like blood or saliva would be generally higher with respect to samples that we would characterize as a touch or a trace sample. But that's speaking generally. That's not to guarantee that, sample to sample, there's always variation.
Is DNA fragile, meaning that, just because someone touches something, does that automatically mean that they leave their DNA behind?
I can only speak to what is recovered when we do our testing, the results that we get. So just because if we knew for certain that someone did handle an item, it's not necessarily guaranteed that we would be able to test that item and recover results that would be consistent with that individual.
Do elements like heat, dirt, water potentially destroy or wipe away DNA?
There are a variety of factors that can influence whether or not DNA is damaged. So DNA can be what we call degraded, which is damaged over time. So things like heat, moisture, mold, bacteria, they can damage the DNA, which can impact and negatively influence our ability to get DNA profiles. And then DNA can be lost. It can be wiped or washed away.
So when you do your testing, when you have unknown samples and then known samples, did you do both of those types of testing in this case?
Yes, an unknown sample would be a type of sample where if a DNA profile is recovered, the origin of that profile is unknown. So any type of crime scene evidence, something like a swab from a firearm, a swab from a vehicle, those types of things are what we would characterize as unknown or questioned or evidence items. And we contrast that with reference samples or known samples. And these are samples that are taken directly from an individual and are what represent their known reference profile. Those generally come in the form of an oral or a buccal swab. BUCCAL is a buccal swab, or sometimes we will receive blood samples where they'll draw a sample of someone's blood and deposit it on a card.
And so what is commonly done, and you do in this case, is you have these known or reference samples, and then if you develop DNA on one of these unknown samples, you compare the two to see if they are consistent.
Correct. That is the ultimate aim in trying to do a forensic DNA analysis, is we want to test the questioned evidence items and try to obtain whatever DNA results we can. There's a point at which we will determine if we do get a DNA profile, does it meet our lab's criteria to be suitable for comparison to references or not suitable for comparison to references. If we do have unknown profiles that are suitable for comparison, then we will take any known reference samples that we have and we will compare the profiles of those individuals to the unknown profiles and see if we can make determinations supporting either inclusion or exclusion of the individual as a contributor.
Is it common in your training experience to examine an unknown item and not find any DNA at all?
It is possible that we would test an unknown item, and some of the conclusions we may draw is one of the lab steps. We will estimate how much human DNA is present in the sample, and sometimes we do not detect any amount of human DNA present, and we would characterize that as no DNA detected. There are times where we might test a sample and there may or may not be an indication of human DNA present, but when we do the last step in our process and process the sample on the detection instrument, we get no detected data, and we would report that as no results. So those are some of the conclusions we might reach where we test a sample and we don't actually obtain DNA results.
Is it common in your training experience to actually find some amount of DNA, but that DNA is just not suitable for inclusion or exclusion?
Right, that is one type of conclusion we might reach as well. We might develop DNA results and observe a profile, but the profile may not meet our criteria to be suitable for comparison. So we'll make that decision. The profile is either determined to be suitable for comparison, it might be determined to be not suitable for comparison, and some profiles, occasionally with mixture samples, a mixture is a DNA profile that appears to come from more than one person, we may separate that into two separate components, which we would refer to as a major and a minor component. And within the context of a mixture at our laboratory, the major component is the part that is suitable for comparison, the minor part is the part that's not suitable for comparison.
Thank you for that explanation. Did you bring your file and review your reports in this case?
I did review the file and my reports. I have brought some selections of some copied materials in case I might need to refer to something.
I'm going to try to go through this fast. We're not going to ask you everything that you did, so just kind of follow my lead and we'll get through this. The most important question, I guess, for the state of Florida versus Mario Fernandez is, during the course of your comparison, did you find any of Mario Fernandez's DNA on any of the unknown samples?
We would never say with any certainty that we found someone's DNA on an item or that a person is definitely a contributor. What we would describe our results as is there support for inclusion of this person as a possible contributor? And to summarize the results from this case with respect to Mr. Fernandez-Saldana, of the unknown profiles that had components or were entirely suitable for comparison, there was no support for inclusion of Mr. Fernandez-Saldana as a possible contributor to the components that were suitable for comparison.
Same question with regard to Shanna Gardner. There was no inclusion of anything of her.
Same characterization with respect to the comparisons to Ms. Gardner. There was no support for inclusion of Ms. Gardner as a possible contributor to the suitable components of profiles that were suitable for comparison.
Or any of the police officers that you got known samples for?
Correct. We received a number of elimination samples from various law enforcement officials, and there was no support for inclusion of any of those individuals to any of the suitable components of profiles that were suitable for comparison.
Or Justin Bridegan, the brother of Jared Bridegan, no inclusion there?
There was no support for inclusion of Justin Bridegan to any of those profile components that were suitable for comparison.
Two more names, Jeremy Ordway and Jimmy Jones. Same question.
I know we received a reference sample from Mr. Ordway. I'm not sure about Mr. Jones. Could you refer to an exhibit number?
Yeah, it may take me a second. We'll go on to another part, my co-counsel.
I can't answer with respect to Mr. Ordway that there was no support for inclusion of Mr. Ordway as a contributor to any of the profile components that were suitable for comparison.
So, of all the items, and there were many items you tested that did not either have enough DNA or had no DNA. Is that fair?
So some of the items may have been described as no DNA detected, which is where when we do that step where we estimate how much human DNA is in a sample, we did not have any detectable level of human DNA. There were some samples that fit that description. There were also some samples where we processed those samples on the detection instrument and there was no detectable signal, so those were no results.
So now we're going to get to the things where we do find matches. Beginning first, I'm going to talk about the shell casings number 3 and shell casings number 4. Did you find that there was an inclusion with regard to the victim, in this case, Jared?
So those items in question, these are two 10-millimeter cartridge cases recovered from the scene, assigned lab exhibits 3 and 4. We will sample cartridge cases in pairs on occasion, which is what was done in this case. So lab exhibits 3 and 4 were sampled together. That resulted in lab exhibit 3.1. That sample was processed and there was a profile obtained from exhibit 3.1 consistent with being a male DNA profile consistent with a single contributor. Upon comparison to the reference samples in this case, there was support for inclusion of Jared Bridegan as a possible contributor to that DNA profile.
Was there a statistical component that you would assign to show, to give the jury an idea of how forensically important that inclusion was?
So when we report any conclusion as a result of a comparison that is anything other than exclusion, we will report a statistic that is known as a likelihood ratio. A likelihood ratio is a value that can give weight or give support to either inclusion or exclusion of an individual. It is an assessment of how probable the evidence profile is under different possible explanations. One explanation is what we call the inclusionary hypothesis, and this is where we assume that the person we're comparing is a contributor to the profile. The other explanation is what we call the exclusionary hypothesis. This is where we propose that the person of interest is not a contributor, that other unrelated, unknown individuals could be the contributor. So when we do the comparison between Jared Bridegan and Exhibit 3.1, the likelihood ratio value is that it is at least 1 trillion times more likely to observe the evidence profile from Exhibit 3.1 if Jared Bridegan is the contributor than if an unknown, unrelated individual is the contributor.
I'm showing you what's been entered into evidence as State's Exhibit 94. You can see on your screen, State's Exhibit 88C and 88D. You see those? I know they're all bunched together, beginning first with 94. This has been introduced into evidence as the victim's blood spot card. Is that where you developed the full profile from Jared Bridegan? And if it's easier for me to just show it.
Maybe if I look at it myself, yes.
I don't know why I'm saving steps.
So it may be useful at this juncture to point out that at our laboratory, as the forensic biologist, I won't necessarily do all the work in the case myself. We do have lab specialists that assist us with laboratory tasks, and sometimes examiners will do various laboratory tasks for each other. I am the one who's responsible for all the analysis of the data and the reporting. And I bring that up because I see this exhibit, which is ATF and also Lab Exhibit 18, which is the reference sample from Jared Bridegan. This is not a sample that I actually received myself, but I do see the handwritten initials of the lab specialist that did process this item.
And then showing you 88C and 88D, the shell casings. Now, my understanding is those shell casings went through a process to extract DNA different from the normal swabbing. Is that true?
That is correct. At our laboratory, we used a specialized sampling technique known as the rinse and swab technique to recover DNA from fired cartridge cases. It is a technique that we developed in-house, and we published our research in a peer-reviewed research journal. As I look at these evidence packages, I see the lab specialist's handwritten annotation indicating these are lab exhibits 1 and 4 that correspond to 2 of the 10 millimeter cartridge cases.
So the jury has already seen the crime scene photos, and there's no reason to publish those again. But you'll have to kind of stay with me for this analogy. So the jury saw pictures of the deceased Jared Bridegan on the ground. He was bleeding heavily. They heard testimony that the victim was moved during the course of CPR. In other words, first responders got to the victim who was face down. They rolled him over. They performed vigorous CPR, and the victim was bleeding everywhere. They also saw that these shell casings were all collected in the immediate vicinity of the victim, meaning within inches to a few feet away from the victim. Is the finding of the victim's DNA on these shell casings consistent with the DNA being deposited on the shell casings after those shell casings had been fired and left on Mr. Bridegan's CPR? Understand my question?
I heard your description. I don't know what the question is. I'm sorry.
The question is it consistent with your training and experience that the victim's DNA could have been transferred onto the shell casings after they were expelled from the firearm, because the victim who was moving around, bleeding, performing CPR, and the collection of the shell cases all happened in the same area? Is that consistent with your...
I have to be careful how I answer this. What you're describing is what we refer to as activity, which is how we would describe how DNA is actually deposited on items. I don't really have a technique or a method to try and evaluate specific activities as far as trying to determine exactly how a DNA deposition could have occurred. What I can say, which is what is seen in research studies, which I've observed in my own training and in creating training samples for others and in doing my own research, is that when we have, controlled studies where a volunteer will handle or come into direct contact with an item, and then we test that item, we do obtain results that are consistent with an individual coming into direct contact with an item. As far as can I extend that to say with any certainty whether endorsing your specific scenario that you've described, I cannot do that. I do not have a method to do that.
I appreciate that because you're a scientist. My question is not whether that's how the DNA got, just that is within the scientifical probabilities of the world that yes, if a bleeding victim and shell casings are all rolling around the ground, there could be some transfer. Possible.
I would say in general, if an individual comes into direct contact with an item, it is possible to test an item and get results consistent with that individual.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So now we'll get to, the meat of it, which is, did you find any DNA consistent with the known reference sample of Henry Tennant?
There were a number of questioned evidence items that were tested that yielded results that were suitable for comparison. And on comparison to Mr. Tinnon's reference sample, there was support for inclusion of Mr. Tinnon as a possible contributor to some of the evidence items.
Turning to the swab taken from the inner rim of the tire, was that consistent with Mr. Tinnon? And could you explain to the jury your statistical analysis on number 11, the swab from the inside of the rim?
So lab exhibit 11 refers to the swab from the inner rim of the tire, and the cutting of that swab and the sample that we generated is lab exhibit 11.1. There was a DNA profile obtained from exhibit 11.1. That was a partial DNA profile consistent with at least 2 contributors. This was further resolved into a major and minor component. The major component was a partial DNA profile consistent with a single contributor. The minor component was not suitable for comparison. Upon comparison of Mr. Tinnon's profile, there was support for inclusion of Mr. Tinnon as a possible contributor to the major component of exhibit 11.1.
What was the statistical inclusion?
The likelihood ratio value for that comparison was that it was 1.38 million times more likely to observe the DNA profile from exhibit 11.1 if Mr. Tinnon were a contributor with an unknown, unrelated individual than if it came from 2 unrelated, unknown individuals.
Okay, turn to the swab of the keys, the silver key that you took. Did you include Henry Tinnon as a possible contributor to that silver key swab? Number 3.
Lab exhibit 30 was the silver truck key, the sample that we took and generated the profile from. Lab exhibit 30.1. That was characterized as a DNA profile consistent with 2 contributors with at least 1 male present, and that was suitable for comparison. Upon comparison with Mr. Tinnon's reference sample, there was support for inclusion of Mr. Tinnon as a possible contributor to that profile. The likelihood ratio was that it was at least 1 trillion times more likely to observe the DNA profile from exhibit 30.1 if Mr. Tinnon was a contributor with an unknown, unrelated individual than if it came from 2 unrelated, unknown individuals.
Turning to 33.4, the cutting from the steering wheel, were you able to include Henry Tinnon as a contributor to that?
The lab exhibit 33.4 corresponds to a swab from the steering wheel of a pickup truck. That profile was a partial profile consistent with 1 individual. That was suitable for comparison. Upon comparison to Mr. Tinnon's reference sample, there was support for inclusion of Mr. Tinnon. The likelihood ratio was that the DNA profile is at least 1 trillion times more likely if it originated from Henry Tinnon than if it originated from an unknown, unrelated individual.
We'll do the same process. May I please?
Yes. Throughout.
Thank you. States Exhibit 9, we'll start first with States Exhibit 95. Is this the reference sample from Mr. Henry Tinnon that you or your fellow lab people worked on?
This sample I did initial myself, and I see our lab inscription and lab number. This is Exhibit 26, the reference sample from Henry Tinnon.
Okay, and that's going to be States Exhibit 95. All right, States Exhibit 92 is going to be the swab from the inside rim of the tire.
All right, I see the handwritten inscription from the lab specialist who assisted with this case. This is Lab Exhibit 11, the swab taken from the inner rim of the tire.
States Exhibit 193 is going to be the swab from the silver key.
I see the handwritten annotation from the lab specialist, and this is Exhibit 30, the swab from the silver Ford truck key.
States Exhibit 169 is going to be the swab from the serum.
I see my handwritten information. This is Exhibit 33, 4 of 13. There were 13 swabs submitted as part of Exhibit 33, and this is number 4 of 13, which corresponds to the swab of the steering wheel.
Sir, I appreciate your testimony. I have no further.
Thank you. Cross.
Just briefly, Your Honor, may I do it from the defense table?
It's fine.
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
I didn't catch, where did you come in from?
I work at the Forensic Science Lab Washington, which is located in Maryland, just outside D.C.
You flew in today, sir?
I came in yesterday afternoon.
Welcome, Jacksonville. I just want to make sure the jury's clear. You found nothing to include Mario Fernandez, is that correct?
Of the profiles that were suitable for comparison, there was no support for inclusion of Mr. Fernandez-Saldana as a possible contributor to any of those profile components suitable for comparison.
Thank you, sir. I have no further questions.
All right. Any follow-up?
No, Your Honor.
Okay. May the witness be excused.
You may.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Honor.